US-made guns are illegally finding their way to Latin America and helping fuel a wave of violence. We will take a look at the impact on the region. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. The United States is known for having some of the most relaxed firearms laws in the world, to the delight and dismay of the domestic population, depending on one's political views. But the availability of guns also creates problems for America's geographical neighbors in Latin America and the Caribbean, where less developed states struggle to handle the flow of guns into their countries. CGTN's Alistair Baverstock has this report.
Following an armed uprising in February that led Haiti's prime minister to resign, there was little doubt where the weapons in the gangsters' hands had originated. The UN says the firepower that has fueled Haiti's descent into chaos was trafficked from the United States.
There's not a single gun or bullet that's manufactured in Haiti. Almost all of it comes from the United States, a lot of it directly from the port of Miami.
Haiti is by no means the only country that struggles with arms trafficking from the US. South of the border, Mexico's government estimates 200,000 weapons enter the country illegally every year.
Arms trafficking into Mexico is a serious problem. 70% of all the cartel firearms come from the US, available throughout the entire country, and leave criminals in many cases better equipped than local security forces. There are even WhatsApp groups in Mexico dedicated solely to the sale of illicit firearms.
The arguments that we used.
That's led Mexico's government to take legal action against the US firearms industry and the practice of straw purchasers, those who buy guns illegally intending all along to pass them across the border.
The manufacturers and distributors are negligent because they do not monitor and discipline their distribution channels and points of sale, knowingly that their guns are sold to straw purchasers. Companies have to be accountable to what they're doing and the harm Mexico is suffering.
One of the targets of Mexico's lawsuit is Ammo AZ, whose firearms have been found at numerous Mexican crime scenes.
But it's politically motivated, just like the last one was.
It's owned by Vera Chart Murphy, who staunchly defends his business practices.
19 of my guns that are listed that came through my store. 5 years ago, we sell 30,000 guns a year. When you walk up to my counter and you want to buy a gun, we transmit your information to FBI and ATF. They're the ones that tell us yes or no, this person can have a gun. What you do with the firearm once you leave my store has nothing to do with me.
Intentionally or not, as America arms the less developed world, it may be creating problems its neighbors cannot handle. Alistair Baverstock, CGTN, Mexico City.
There's a lot to talk about. Let's bring in our panel. From Monterrey in Mexico, Chantal Flores is an investigative journalist. Michael Vigil is former chief of international operations at the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration. He joins us from Albuquerque, New Mexico. Here in Washington, D.C., Rafael Bernal is a staff writer for The Hill, and Art Estopinan in our studio is president of the Estopinan Group and a former advisor to the chair of the U.S. House Foreign Affairs Committee. Welcome to all of you. Chantal, let me start with you in Monterrey. As we just heard in our report there, 200,000 weapons crossing the border from the United States into Mexico, and we have heard over the years of the level of violence that's been increasing in Mexico. This flow of weapons, it's been called the Iron River, and there's been some interesting research that's been done into what these weapons do in countries like Mexico. For instance, 70% of crimes committed using guns in Mexico are guns from the United States, and in the Caribbean, that figure jumps to 80%. So what is your view on the impact this flow of weapons is having in these countries?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. Mexico is facing a severe crisis of human rights violations and violent crimes. And like you just mentioned, many of them are committed with firearms that can be traced back to the US. And there's definitely a rise in armed conflict across the region, in part because of the diversion of weapons and the illicit armed trafficking. Specifically in Mexico, which is my area of expertise, organized crime groups and also security forces, because we also need to mention that security forces in Mexico and members of law enforcement have also committed human rights violations, right? Such as murders and forced disappearances. And what this has caused is a massive displacement of people. We are now seeing whole towns that are empty. People are being forced to leave their homes, to leave their belongings, and many of them are being forced to migrate to the United States. We have also seen that gender violence has increased, and for instance, femicides, they are increasingly being perpetrated with these weapons that are coming from the US. So I think it's really hard to just blame this flow of guns because of the violence in Mexico, right? Obviously, we need to address what is happening in Mexico with a more comprehensive approach, but it's definitely, I mean, we're seeing on the streets that the firepower that the drug cartels have is having an impact on civilians and whole towns, right? So this is originating a series of problems across the country.
Art, if we look at what's going on here in the United States, which may in a way explain this flow of arms to neighboring countries, in 2020, the Trump administration transferred regulatory authority for firearms exports from the Department of State to the Commerce Department. That move was welcomed by the National Rifle Association, which represents gun manufacturers in the United States. The Commerce Department approved $16 billion worth of arms exports in the first 16 months since Trump made that shift. It rejected only 0.4% of export licenses. That's a problem, isn't it?
Well, the problem is the guns getting into the hands of criminal gangs and drug cartels. Unfortunately, we all witnessed the Operation Fast and Furious during the Obama administration, in which, if you may recall, the ATF allowed for thousands and thousands of guns to go to the Mexican drug cartels because we were supposed to track them, and then the GPS only lasted a day, so then we were left with a whole bunch of drug dealers having US-made guns, which is obviously a big problem.
Rafael, to what extent does the prevalence of guns in Central America, for example, lead to the kind of rampant, mainly drug-related violence, which in turn leads to people fleeing those areas, heading for the United States border? There's a connection here, isn't there?
Absolutely, there's a connection. This availability of guns, which for many decades, it wasn't there because there was an agreement between the Mexican and U.S. government, and there was a capacity to stop the guns at the border. Mexico had very different still has very different gun policies from the United States, and the United States respected that. When that started changing, I would say from the late 80s onwards, but really accelerating from the mid-2000s onwards, it changed the face of organized crime in Mexico and in Central America, and to an extent even farther south, although there's South American drug cartels were much more violent earlier than Mexican drug cartels. But when the face of organized crime changed, it went from being a hyper-local issue in certain parts of the country to basically a national issue, or at least a regional issue, that made some towns and some places in the country unlivable. It's certainly one of the many factors that has pushed outside migration. The Central American case is a little bit different. They've had an overflow of weapons since the 1980s, when in the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union sort of flooded that region with weapons. But you've had the same effect, just over a longer period of time.
Mike, you've worked at the very highest levels of the Drug Enforcement Administration. Has it also been your experience that the nature of the violence that we're seeing in places like Mexico changed from about, as Rafael points out, from about the 80s onwards?
Well, that's correct. And we have to take into consideration that here in the United States, we have about 50,000 gun stores, 50,000 more gun stores than McDonald's has franchises in this country. Mexico only has one gun store for the entire country. And that is based where? On a military base near Mexico City. They sell about 6,500 weapons, low caliber weapons used for hunting or target practicing. The figure that you guys gave of 200,000 weapons, that is very minor. It's more like 300,000 to 500,000 weapons that are flowing into Mexico every year. Now, those weapons, a lot of them go into the hands of these very ultra-violent cartels, such as the Sinaloa cartel, the Jalisco New Generation cartel, and they use that to fight against each other. They fight that to fight the security forces of Mexico. And as a result, we are empowering the people that we're supposed to be fighting. It creates instability in Mexico. But again, empowering these cartels means more drugs coming into the United States. And as a result of that, we have major problems right now with fentanyl, which is killing about 70,000 people every year here in the United States. And fentanyl is being manufactured in Mexico. You take a look at Haiti, you know, not only are we creating instability in Haiti because a lot of weapons are going into the hands of drug gangs that are now pretty much controlling Port-au-Prince. So we create instability. We create the flow of drugs coming into the United States. We create human rights abuses, and we create national security problems in these countries, which affect our national security here in the United States.
Chantal, you know, that connection that Mike just made, the fact that the United States is arming the very groups that it is trying to fight at the same time. I mean, that connection has been recognized by leaders in the region. The Jamaican Prime Minister made that comparison when he addressed the United Nations General Assembly not so long ago. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Several countries in Latin America and the Caribbean are facing an epidemic of crime and violence. The situation is exponentially complicated and exacerbated by the influx of illegal and unregistered small arms into our country. Jamaica does not manufacture guns, but our population suffers from the effects of widely available guns. In the same way that there is a concern about illegal drugs on the streets of the rich countries, there must be concern about guns on the streets of developing countries like Jamaica.
So Chantal, I mean, you have the Jamaican Prime Minister there making the point that there are drugs flowing from Latin American countries to the streets of rich countries like the United States, and in turn there are guns going from these rich countries to the countries of Latin America. It's a vicious cycle, is it not? And is there any way of breaking that cycle?
That's a very hard question, and I think it's a question that we are all having in Mexico, especially now that we have presidential elections this year. I think something that is missing in this debate. Obviously, it's great what the Mexican government is doing by filing this first lawsuit, right? It's the first country to file a lawsuit against the U.S. gun industry. But something that is missing is also the responsibility of the U.S. government, of the Mexican government in this violence, right? There are also so many legally acquired firearms that end up in the hands of drug cartels. And there are also many security forces who are committing these human rights violations against the people of Mexico in this so-called war on drugs, right? Yeah, I don't think I'm answering your question.
Well, I
but
mean,
think the first step, at least coming, from this, from the Mexican side, is that we need a government that is great, that is doing this against the U.S. gun industry, but that also needs to start taking responsibility and accountability for the crisis that we are facing right now.
Yeah, I think what you're telling us, Chantal, gives us a good idea of how difficult this issue is to resolve. Art, let's look at the situation here in Washington. How much concern is there, for instance, in the United States Congress, or for that matter, among U.S. law enforcement authorities on what is going on south of the border? I mean, there's a serious gun problem in the United States as well. But the fact that, there's this seemingly unimpeded flow of guns from here to Latin America.
Unfortunately, to answer my colleague's question, I believe that this issue requires a multifaceted response. And unfortunately, in the U.S. government, we haven't seen a priority to try to curtail this issue that is going on. I believe that the United States needs to work with all of these different governments throughout our hemisphere, Mexico, and the rest of the countries, to bring these cartel leaders to justice by prosecuting them. We saw that with El Chapo from Mexico, that he was brought to the United States, he was prosecuted. Also, the former president of Honduras, President Hernandez, who was prosecuted in New York for drug trafficking. So I believe that the United States needs to have a greater leadership role in prosecuting, working together with all these governments of all these narco traffickers that are unfortunately killing their own people. That's number one. Number two, we need to make sure that the DEA and the ATF pursue the laws that are on the books and prosecute all of these leaders that are trafficking in drugs, and making sure that they no longer are able to.
The implication there is that the DEA and other authorities are not following the law?
I think that they are following the law, Anand, but they're not prioritizing a more comprehensive program, which I believe the actual crisis today requires.
All right, let me ask Mike about that. Mike, as I said, you've been at the DEA at the operations level. Are organizations like the DEA, other law enforcement authorities, doing all they can?
They are doing all they can. But it's a very complex situation, because we have to work with foreign governments. For example, Mexico, in terms of attacking the cartels, in terms of reducing violence, the flow of drugs coming into the United States. But a lot of times you get presidents in these countries that have very varying ideas of how to combat the situation. For example, in Mexico, López Obrador became president, and he said he was going to diminish the violence in that country by taking a non-confrontational approach to the cartels, something he called abrazos y no balazos, hugs and not gunshots. And unfortunately, that policy did not work. It has not worked. But let me say another thing is that in terms of your question, how can we combat this a little bit better, is that we need to get a Congress that is going to act on these laws. For example, prohibit the sale of assault weapons.
Right.
There's no reason that an ordinary citizen needs assault weapons.
Yeah,
They need to do away with high-capacity magazines.
right,
They
Mike. That
need
is a big debate.
regulate.
That is a big debate that's going on in the United States right now. I just want to, yeah.
And we have a lot of politicians that are receiving significant millions of dollars from the National Rifle Association.
Right.
So they therefore refuse to move forward with appropriate legislation.
Yeah. Rafael, we are talking about the situation in Mexico, the drug-related violence there, but it's not always drug-related, is it? Because we have a situation in Haiti right now where we have a political and a security crisis. This is a country, a small country in the Caribbean that is awash with weapons right now. It's also a country that doesn't manufacture weapons at all, doesn't manufacture any kind of ammunition. All these weapons have made their way from the United States to Haiti.
You have to ask yourself why Haiti is such a magnet for weapons. We know why Mexico is a magnet for weapons. We know why Colombia was in the 80s. Haiti is a magnet for weapons because it has had such weak governance over its entire most of its history that basically the elites, the business leaders, anybody who has the means has to arm their own police. We see them as gangs, and they are gangs, and sometimes they get out of control. They claim some independence, but the money to pay for those weapons usually comes from people who are seeking to supplant the non-existent protections that the government is not granting.
Chantal, in our report at the beginning of the show, our reporter there talked about the lawsuit that Mexico has launched against the United States, trying to make U.S. gun manufacturers responsible for the violence that we see in countries like Mexico. What do you make of the merits of that lawsuit, and can it have an impact beyond Mexico, perhaps in other parts of Latin America as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously something huge, right? And we just got 2 weeks ago this federal trial court in Arizona saying that the lawsuit against gun dealers can proceed. And then we had in January the ruling saying that the first lawsuit against U.S. gun manufacturers can also proceed. So obviously this is huge. Sorry about that. This is huge because now Mexico can obtain evidence from the gun industry and hopefully prove its case. And this can definitely set a precedent for cross-border litigation and about also, the global fight against armed trafficking. So I think it's great what Mexico is doing. It's unbelievable, right? What happened in the past 2 or 3 months that both courts allowed the lawsuits to continue. We'll see what happens in the coming months. But what experts told me is that just being able to move into the discovery phase is something huge, right? Because now Mexico can have more information to prove its case and link what is happening in the country, the violence that is happening in the country with U.S. guns. Obviously, this is just a tiny part of the larger fight. One of the things that Mexico mentioned in the lawsuit is that this is a step forward in obtaining justice for the victims, which is, the people of Mexico. And I don't think that's going to happen with these lawsuits.
Rafael, very quickly, I've just got a little bit of time left, but, at least one thinks that it's all bad news. There is a little bit of good news, and that comes from the Dominican Republic, which is just across the border from Haiti, where the government there has hit upon a novel approach. Well, I'm not sure how novel it is. Other countries have tried this as well, but they're actually paying people to hand in illegal guns, and it seems to be working. 15,500 guns have been handed in. What do you make of that? And is that a model that could perhaps work in other countries?
It's a model that works especially in urban areas, and it works when you're dealing with individuals or gangs. It worked to an extent in cities like LA in the 80s and 90s. It might make a dent in the issue.
Yeah. Art, one final thing I want to ask you about, and we, as I said, got a little bit of time. You know, we find that in many of these countries where we talk about the prevalence of guns, countries being awash in guns, in some respects, guns have become a kind of currency. Because if we look in Haiti right now, they're exchanging guns for drugs with Jamaica. They're exchanging guns for food from Jamaica. It's because of the political situation, right?
Yeah, well, obviously, unfortunately, the situation in Haiti is totally chaotic, non-governance. Hopefully, the United States and France and Canada in the past have been part of the international community that has helped Haiti, so-called.
Right.
But the reality is that guns kill people and kill many innocent people.
Right.
The crisis is only going to get worse unless all of these countries get together and prioritize the gun violence.
As you point out, it has to be a cooperative effort. Well, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.